This is from the New York Times. Sons of rich black families fare no better than sons of working class whites, by Emily Badger and Claire Kane Miller. Black boys raised in America, even in the wealthiest family and living in some of the most well-to-do neighborhoods, still earn less in adulthood than white boys with similar backgrounds, according to a new sweeping study that traced the lives of millions of children. White boys who grew up rich are likely to remain that way. Black boys raised at the top, however, are more likely to become poor than to stay wealthy in their own adult househoods. Even when children grew up next to each other with parents who earned similar incomes, black boys fare worse than white boys in 99% of America. And the gaps only worsen in the kind of neighborhoods that promise low poverty and good schools. According to the study, led by researchers at Stanford, Harvard, and the Census Bureau, income inequality between blacks and whites is driven entirely by what is happening among these boys and the men that they become. Black and white girls from families with comparable earnings attain similar individual incomes as adults. You would have thought at some point you escaped the poverty trap, said Nathaniel Hendren, a Harvard economist and author of the study. Black boys, even rich black boys, can seemingly never assume that. The study, based on anonymous earnings and demographic data for virtually all Americans now in their late 30s, debunks a number of other widely held hypotheses about income inequality. Gaps persisted even when black and white boys grew up in families with the same income, similar family structures, similar education levels, and even similar levels of accumulated wealth. The disparities that remain also can't be explained by differences in cognitive ability, an argument made by people who cite racial gaps in test scores that appear for both black boys and girls. If such inherent differences existed by race, you've got to explain to me why these putative ability differences aren't handicapping women, said David Brusky, a Stanford sociologist who has reviewed the research. A more likely possibility, the author suggests, is that test scores don't accurately measure the abilities of black children in the first place. If this inequality can't be explained by individual or household traits, much of what matters probably lies outside the home, in surrounding neighborhoods, in the economy, and in the society that views black boys differently from white boys and even from black girls. One of the most popular liberal post-racial ideas is the idea that the fundamental problem is class and not race. And clearly this study explores that idea, said Ibram Kendi, a professor and director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. But for whatever reason, we're unwilling to stare racism in the face. The authors, including the Stanford economist Raj Chetty and two census researchers, Maggie R. Jones and Sonia R. Porter, tried to identify neighborhoods where poor black boys do well and as well as whites. The problem, Mr. Chetty, is that there are essentially no such neighborhoods in America. The few neighborhoods that met this standard were in areas that showed less discrimination in surveys and tests of racial bias. They mostly had low poverty rates. And intriguingly, these pockets, including parts of the Maryland suburbs of Washington and corners of Queens and the Bronx, were places where many lower-income black children had fathers at home. Poor black boys did well in such places, whether their own fathers were present or not. That is a path-breaking finding, said William Julius Wilson, a Harvard sociologist whose books have chronicled the economic struggles of black men. They're not talking about the direct effects of a boy's own parents' marital status. They're talking about the presence of fathers in a given census tract. Other fathers in the community can provide boys with role models and mentors, researchers say, and their presence may indicate other neighborhood factors that benefit families, like lower incarceration rates and better job opportunities. The research makes clear that there is something unique about the obstacles black males face. The gap between Hispanics and whites is narrower, and their incomes will converge within a couple of generations if mobility stays the same. Asian Americans earn more than whites raised at the same income level, or about the same when first-generation immigrants are excluded. Only Native Americans have an income gap comparable to African Americans. But the disparities are the widest for black boys. This crystallizes and puts data behind this thing that we always knew was there because we either felt it ourselves or we've seen it over time, said Will Jawando, 35, who worked in the Obama White House on My Brother's Keeper, a mentoring initiative for black boys. Even without this data, the people who worked on that project, he said, believe that individual and structural racism targeted black men in ways that required policies devised specifically for them. Mr. Jawando, the son of a Nigerian father and a white mother, grew up poor in Silver Spring, Maryland. The Washington suburb contains some of the rare neighborhoods where black and white boys do equally well. Mr. Jawando, who identifies as black, is now a married lawyer with 3 daughters. He is among the black boys who climbed from the bottom to the top. He was one of the 20 million children born between 1978 and 1983, whose lives are reflected in the study. Using census data included tax files, the researchers were able to link the adult fortunes of those children to their parents' incomes. Names and addresses were hidden from the researchers. Previous research suggested some reasons there may be a large income gap between black and white men, but not between women. Other studies show that boys across races are more sensitive than girls to disadvantages like growing up in poverty or facing discrimination. While black women also face negative effects of racism, black men often experience racial discrimination differently. As early as preschool, they are more likely to be disciplined in school. They are pulled over or detained and searched by police officers more often. It's not just being black, but being male that has been hyper-stereotyped in this negative way in which we've made black men scary, intimidating, with a propensity toward violence, said Noel Hurd, a psychology professor at the University of Virginia. She said this racist stereotype particularly hurts black men economically, now that service sector jobs requiring interaction with customers have replaced the manufacturing jobs that previously employed men with less education. The new data shows that 21% of black men raised at the very bottom were incarcerated, according to a snapshot of a single day during the 2010 census. Black men raised at the top 1% by millionaires were as likely to be incarcerated as white men raised in households earning about $36,000 a year. At the same time, boys benefit more than girls from adult attention and resources, as do low-income and non-white children, a variety of studies have found. Mentors who aren't children's parents, but who share these children's gender and race, serve a particularly important role for black children, Ms. Hurd has found. That explains why the presence of black fathers in a neighborhood, even if not in a child's home, appears to make a difference. Some of the widest black-white income gaps in this study appear in wealthy communities. This fits with previous research that has shown that the effects of racial discrimination cross class lines. Although all children benefit from growing up in places with higher incomes and with more resources, black children do not benefit nearly as much as white children do. Moving black boys to opportunity is no guarantee they can tap into it. Simply because you're in an area that is more affluent, it's still hard for black boys to present themselves as independent from the stereotype of the black criminality, said Kiera Bridges, a professor of law and anthropology at Boston University, who has written a coming paper on discrimination against affluent black people. This dynamic still weighs on Mr. Jawando. He has a good income, multiple degrees, and political aspirations. He is running for county council in Montgomery County, where he grew up. But in his own community, he is careful to dress like a professional. I think if I'm putting on a sweatsuit, if I go somewhere, will I be seen just kind of a hood black guy, he said, or will people recognize me at all? Those small daily decisions, to wear a blazer or not, follow him despite his success. I don't think you escape those things, he said. This study makes it possible to look in greater detail at interrelated disparities the researchers have long studied around income, marriage rates, and incarcerations. Here are some of the other findings. There's a large gap in the marriage rates of white and black Americans, even after accounting for income. One reason income gaps between whites and blacks appear so large at the household level is that black men and women are less likely to be married. That means their households are more likely to have a single income, not two. For this reason and others, many point to differences in family structure as a primary driver of racial income inequality. If black children don't have married parents, the argument goes, they're more likely to grow up with fewer resources and less adult attention at home. This study found, however, that broad income disparities still exist between black and white men, even when they're raised in homes with the same incomes and the same family structure. As this chart shows, a black man raised by two parents together in the 90th percentile, making around $140,000 a year, earns about the same in adulthood as a white man raised by a single mother making $60,000 alone. Asian Americans earn more in adulthood than whites who were raised in families with similar incomes. But that advantage largely disappears when the researchers look only at children whose parents were born in the United States. Non-immigrant Asian Americans fare about as well in the economy as whites. The study did not divide Asian Americans or Hispanics into smaller groups by country of origin, collapsing potential significant differences between, say, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans. The worst places for poor white children are almost all better than the best places for poor black children. In previous work, some of these same researchers looked at how the prospects for poor children vary depending on where they grew up. The middle map above shows those earlier results. Poor children have appeared to have less opportunity in the Southeast and more in the northern Great Plains. With the new data, it's now possible to look at the effects of geography separately for blacks and whites. Poor white children struggle in parts of the Southeast and Appalachia, but they still fare better there than poor black children do in most of America. In effect, the worst places for whites produce outcomes that are about as good as the best places for blacks. These new maps also suggest that part of the reason the Southeast looks bad for all children in the middle map is that the region is home to many black children who fare particularly poorly there. Very few non-white Americans start at the very top. African Americans made up about 35% of all children raised in the bottom 1% of the income distribution. They made up less than 1% of the children at the very top. This picture captures both a source of racial inequality and consequence of it. White children are more likely to start life with economic advantages. We now know that even when they start with the same advantages as black children, white boys still fare better, only reinforcing the disparities seen here. Real starting positions. The latter charts also have shown equal number of black and white boys raised by rich or poor families. What would happen, in other words, if we started with 10,000 boys and half were black and half were white? In reality, whites and blacks are not represented equally across the income spectrum. More than 2/3 of black boys are raised by poor or lower middle class families, while more than half of white boys are raised by rich or upper middle class families. The chart below depicts boys from every income quintile, not just the top or bottom, proportion according to their real starting place in life. And that is from the New York Times. Now, even though they say a lot of true things about family structure, marriage, having dads, which they always put in there, they always put that caveat into these studies. They kind of like soften the blow a little bit. But what the study shows is that even with the advantages of a rich family, intact family structure, two parents in a household, all the other kind of stuff that we associate with success, most black children will fall out of that strata that they started in. So even if everything's perfect, black boys or black men still have to struggle. The New York Times kind of glosses over the racism aspect or the prejudice aspect that this country has against black males, period. Starting from black boys all the way up. Even wealthy, upscale people, black families, have issues with the schools and how they treat their black boys. That is a constant thread. Now, they touch on things like saying that there has to be programs specifically for black boys so that they have a chance to succeed, because the odds against them are greater than anybody else or any other sector in this country, which everybody knows. Everybody's been knowing for 200 years, but everybody's been denying. Oh, if black boys had a better family structure, if black boys were raised in wealthier neighborhoods, if black men were raised blah, blah, all that is bullshit. All that is bullshit. Black women try to throw the same shade. All that is bullshit. If you want black boys to succeed, you're going to have to make an exceptional effort. Everybody knows that the discrimination against black males is double what it is against everybody else. Remember, they show charts that even wealthy black kids represent 10% of the people that remain at their socioeconomic level. And the reverse is like 1%. There is always downward pressure on black males. And everybody pretends that you can treat them the same way you do everybody else. No, they're never treated like everybody else. And when they get to be adults, as this is shown, no matter what neighborhood they grew up in, no matter how many advantages that they have, they still have to go out and prove themselves over and over again, which is something that the Moynihan Report says. Even if you live yourself out of poverty, up into the upper middle class, you can only maintain that for one generation only before the weight of who you are as a black man starts pulling you back down. You constantly have to keep reinventing the wheel. The struggle never stops for black men. We don't prepare our boys for that struggle because we think that we've overcome it, which is absolutely bullshit. Not in this society. It doesn't exist in this society. If you're a black man, you have a bullseye on your back and 2 strikes against you. That is the way it is. I don't care what women say. I don't care what white liberals say. I don't care what conservatives say. If you're not prepared to compete as a black man in this society, you're going to get run over. A rich black dude has to compete the same way Pookie and Ray Ray does at the bottom. Because in the eyes of America, there ain't no difference between a rich black man and a poor black man. Like the old saying says, what do they call a black man with a PhD? A nigga. It ain't changed, folks. It hasn't changed. The only difference between now and back 50 years ago, at least you had your women behind you. Now your women have got in league with the white woman, and they're trying to step over you up that ladder. And they don't even realize it because they think that their experience is the same as yours, which this study proves that it is not. So we need to get real with this. We need to get real with this reality, both male and female. Otherwise, this black community will not stand. It will get eaten up and absorbed within a couple of generations, if not already. So either we're going to band together, do something for the black boys. I don't give a shit about the black men. It is what it is. Black men have to struggle. It is what it is. But you at least have to do something for the black boys if you want a future. If you want a black community 3 generations from now, you got to do something for the black boys. If you do not, if you will not, we might as well pack it up and go home. We might as well pack it up and go home. Might as well pack your shit up and move to Africa and forget about white America. Because those are your options. Let's get real with this, folks. Stop tossing this bullshit around. Anyway, with that, that's all I have for this one. I may do something else on this one. But for right now, this is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one.